Hello and welcome everyone. This week Human Rights Watch published its 712 pages annual report stressing that human rights crises do not arise from nowhere. Governments that fail to live up to their legal obligations to protect human rights at home sow the seeds of discontent, instability and ultimately crisis. The report is covering everything from war, media freedoms, refugees, gender rights, unchecked authoritarian power, among others. So for more details about this report, joining me now from London, Yasmin Ahmed, the Director of Human Rights Watch in the United Kingdom. Welcome to the show, Yasmin, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I know you put the war in Ukraine at the top of your agenda, saying that Russian President Vladimir Putin is operating with impunity. With what you have monitored and documented in Ukraine last year, are you optimistic, and what would you expect this year?
Yes, well, look, as you said, there's been obviously, as your listeners will know, there's been a full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we know that there's been a full-scale assault of the civilian population in Ukraine. And it's extremely, extremely worrying. But what we do know from 2022 is that whilst this invasion and the war crimes and other human rights abuses and violations which have happened as a result of them and continue to happen, remain and continue, we also know that the international community has, in fact, mobilised. And we've seen that in an unprecedented way. In fact, for decades, we've never seen it like this. So we've seen the international community really come together, both in terms of international accountability at the International Criminal Court, utilising other UN mechanisms, and states also using sanctions and other measures to put pressure on Putin to stop the violations and stop the war. So whilst it hasn't yet stopped, I think it's very important to say that now the wheels of accountability are turning. And whilst it may take time, the violations are being documented and there is the potential for accountability. And what we're saying now is the international community needs to continue to respond in this way, both in respect of Ukraine, but in respect of the other human rights crises that continue today in the world.
Do you think this year things in Ukraine may get better?
Well, look, it's hard to say, but I think what we are saying as a human rights organisation is that there needs to be continued pressure on Russia. There needs to be continued and united voice against the Russian aggression and the continued crimes and violations that are happening. And I think that is really, and there needs to be the wheels of motion in terms of accountability that continue to run. So whilst, as we say, we might not immediately see a cessation to the conflict, what we will do and what we've seen in other conflicts around the world, including in the former Yugoslavia and elsewhere, whilst it may not happen in a day, a month, or even a year, there can be accountability when the international community gets together and when there is political appetite. So I think we are, as a human rights organisation, we will continue to rigorously document the violations that are happening. We will continue to put political pressure on states to do what they're doing. And we will continue to ensure that the wheels of accountability continue to flow.
Yeah, as I said in my introduction, this report is covering 100 countries over the world. You cover everything from war, media freedoms, refugees and gender rights in different parts of this world. What are the main findings of your report, Yasmin?
So what we found, and I think it really sort of builds on from what I've been saying, is that whilst there are human rights violations that continue and very systematic and horrendous violations that continue across the world, and we only need to name just a few of them to highlight situations, some of which are new, some of which including situations that have got so much worse, like Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sudan and elsewhere. But we're also seeing ongoing violations across the Middle East, Asia, in Europe and elsewhere. But I think our main findings from the report is that whilst they continue and we're documenting them and we'll continue to document them, there are spaces and glimmers of hope through this. There are alliances of states that are coming together in relation to climate change, in relation to accountability. For example, the Gambia bringing a case to the World Court in relation to what Myanmar is doing to its Rohingya population. We're seeing states coming together in an unprecedented number, speaking out against the crimes that are being committed by China in relation to Xinjiang and the detention of millions of Uyghur Muslims there. So what we're seeing is there are movements towards states realising that it's in their interest globally, because what we've seen is turning away from human rights does not ensure stability. In fact, it ensures the absolute opposite. So it's in the interests of states, and there are certainly a growing number of states who are moving in that direction. We're also seeing, really importantly, that grassroots movements, people around the world are speaking out. I mean, they're taking unprecedented risks in China, in Afghanistan, in countries all over the world to speak out against the repression of their regimes, of the governments which are controlling them. And that is incredibly both inspiring, but it also says that there's opportunities there. And we're pushing states, we're pushing corporations, we're pushing the international community as a whole to be supporting those voices, the people who are putting everything at risk, to support their rights and to ensure that they have dignity.
Yeah, right. I want to turn to another place on your report, which is Egypt. So the question, why did you describe the situation there like Egypt, a year of whitewashing despite dire crisis?
Well, we know that Egypt has superficially taken steps to make change in relation to how it, politically and otherwise. But what Human Rights Watch has documented across the year, and in fact, it's only getting worse throughout the decades and that we've been documenting the human rights violations in Egypt, is that the repression against civil society continues. The repression against political activists, against journalists, against human rights lawyers and others remains, and in fact getting worse. We're seeing not only a shrinking but a suffocating of civil society in Egypt. We saw the regulations that came out in relation to the NGO law, which only confirm the restrictions upon civil society in terms of what they can do, how they can operate, and so on and so forth, and the surveillance that takes place against those very human rights organisations themselves. We also saw that repression play out on a daily basis in relation to COP28. 27, where there was ongoing surveillance of people who'd come to Egypt for that conference. And we also saw the continued repression of voices that were speaking out against the authorities in Egypt. We also know there's continuing impunity of the violations that have been taking place by security forces in Egypt. We know that there's been sexual violence, there's ongoing detention of political dissidents and harm that's happening to them in detention. And so the violations that we continue to document mean that we are very concerned that whilst they may be superficial attempts at making change in relation to Egypt, what we're seeing in reality as a human rights organisation is that the situation in Egypt for human rights is being suffocated. You only need to name Ala, one of the British citizens, the dual national, who the UK government have been calling on to be released, who remains in detention without any proper safeguards in relation to being charged with anything. And this is only emblematic of what the situation is for human rights defenders in Egypt.
But the Egyptian regime, the government and the president, they keep praising themselves that last year Egypt took several steps towards human rights. For example, President Sisi declared 2022 the year of civil society, sponsored national dialogue and hosting the COP27 UN climate conference in November, released a few journalists and political prisoners from jail, and he invited a German journalist to come and stay in Egypt and monitor the human rights situation. So what are your views on all these positive steps from the government perspective?
Well, I would say that really the facts speak for themselves. Whilst obviously Sisi has made certain statements and, as you said, some steps, they are so wholly insufficient in terms of what needs to be done, the reforms that need to be done, and the repression continues. So whilst there are, as we said, certain statements that have been made and certain things that have been done, what we're seeing on the ground is wholly opposite to what's being said. We're seeing continued repression of the political opposition, of human rights activists. We're seeing continued impunity for the security forces in relation to people that are detained, LGBT individuals. We've seen individuals, as we know, like Sarah Hegazi, who was detained and mistreated for merely for her sexual orientation, and then unfortunately, and very unfortunately, took her life as a result of that. So really, whilst there may be certain things that are being said, the reality on the ground for a political dissident, for somebody who speaks up for human rights in Egypt, is not a light one, is not one that I would want to swap places with. And so I think there is certainly much more that can be done. And I think there is an onus, and this is very important, there's onus on governments like the UK, the US, Canada, and many other countries who continue to have a security and broader diplomatic relationship with Egypt,
and
that they are not putting enough on the table to push Egypt in the right direction.
Yeah, and do you think this is political hypocrisy from this Western government?
Well, I certainly think that they should be doing more. If they care about these things, if they genuinely care about human rights, if they genuinely care about freedom of the media, if they genuinely care about things that they speak about all the time, then it certainly is hypocritical for them to then be prioritizing and not be willing to sacrifice some of the things that they gain as a result, and also not to be aware of the fact that some of the things that they perceive as gains, in fact, are long-term losses. While they perceive Egypt as a very important security partner, you're not ever going to have security when fundamentally you undermine human rights, the rule of law, and you create instability. And we've seen that in the Sinai. We've seen that ongoing in relation to how Egypt is dealing with the counterterrorism threat and the unlawful extrajudicial executions that happen, and the fact that there is no stability when you don't have human rights. So I think Western governments and other governments that continue to have relationships with Egypt need to be thinking very clearly about not only the commitments they make about human rights, but their commitment to broader security and stability, which is never, ever won and has never been won through having relationships with and turning a blind eye to regimes that continue to commit human rights violations.
Yeah, and you know, Yasmin, while talking about Sinai, there is an argument with the government. They are saying, okay, there is a media banning and security grip, and Human Rights Watch keep saying this and keep publishing a report that there is a security grip on North Sinai and media banning. So how Human Rights Watch and other rights groups were able to monitor and document all of these violations on the ground in North Sinai?
Well, Human Rights Watch documents violations in many, many parts of the world, and unfortunately in increasingly many parts of the world where we're unable to get on the ground because of the fact that governments won't allow us to be there. So, and the situation is too dangerous for us by virtue of the government's actions. So, I mean, this is happening all over the world, in Afghanistan, in Myanmar, across the world, in Iran. We're documenting continuously human rights violations. And we have our very, very strong and I would say very reliable, and it has been reliable for decades, our methodology. We obviously speak to people. We have many different ways of speaking to people. We make sure we corroborate our evidence and the facts that we find. And so whilst we may not be able to be on the ground because governments across the world in relation to many issues, because governments will not allow us to be there and the situation is too unsafe, we still are able, thankfully, to document the human rights violations. And certainly, if there are things that are factually wrong, we ask governments to come forward, but it's certainly not the case that they come forward and provide evidence to suggest that the facts that we've provided are not true.
To be honest, the governments in Egypt, every single time they give a statement about Human Rights Watch, Egyptian Foreign Ministry denies your reports and accusing the organization as biased and publishing inaccurate information. What do you think?
And well, we're very open always for the government to come forward and identify where our inaccuracies are. Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't think anything less that the government would likely say to us that what we're saying is not correct. I mean, their position clearly is that they will continue the human rights violations. And they obviously, like many countries around the world who do that, don't want to be pulled out for the violations and the crimes that they continue to commit. So that's not unusual. If there is anything factually wrong with what we've said, we ask governments every day to speak up, to provide us with the evidence which suggests that we, and the facts which suggest that we are wrong. And until that's the case, we will continue to do our job, which is to highlight the human rights, the persistent human rights violations that continue in these countries.
I think there was an opportunity in the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, while Human Rights Watch and other NGOs confront the government in front of the media, in front of the world. How do you see this experience with the Egyptian regime face to face in Sharm el-Sheikh?
Well, I think it was obviously there's partly these international events provide an opportunity to do that, to be able to speak face to face with regimes and governments that sometimes will not even have a dialogue with us. But what we are very concerned about is that these events are used by governments like Egypt and Qatar and other places around the world and Rwanda. There are plenty of governments around the world that are awarded or provided with opportunities to host international world events, and they allow them to whitewash or greenwash or whatever you want to call it, the human rights violations that are going on by virtue of holding an international conference. But I think the conference in Egypt, whilst obviously, as you note, there was opportunities to speak to some Egyptian officials, it also highlighted the persistent human rights violations. The fact that there are so many human rights organisations in Egypt, including ones that deal with the environment, that are trying to promote the environment and rights around the environment, who are either banned, some of whom are also some of the human rights organisations, many of their members in jail, in fact, without any adequate charges, in indefinite detention, so on and so forth, and mistreated. And the fact that what we saw in Egypt, the fact that there would continue to be surveillance of individuals who went to COP for the purpose of this environmental conference, says to me, actually, it provided an opportunity to actually highlight some of those violations. But I think we need to be very careful about not allowing countries to utilise these events as a means of otherwise obfuscating the very real situation for human rights organisations, environmental activists on a daily basis in Egypt, for example.
Yeah, and there is an old-age argument in Egypt, Yasmin, in the last decade since the military coup in 2013, that Egypt has no political prisoners in 23 or 25 jails since President Sisi took power via the military coup. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, that's just clearly factually incorrect. We have, documented, Human Rights Watch and many other organisations have documented the fact that there are many people who are in prison for their political activities, who have been charged with spurious offences, or some of them have not been charged with offences at all, who've been mistreated. I mean, one only needs to look at the NGO regulation that came out this year, which prohibits work of a political nature, which says everything about the fact that, of course, there are people in jail who are being detained for their political activities. So the very notion that the government will say that no one's in prison because of their political activities runs counter to the facts and runs counter their own regulations and laws. So I think really there's just no ground to stand on there.
Okay, my final question, Yasmin. Are you hoping that your report, your efforts revealing all these facts, human rights violation around the world, could put pressure on the international communities, world leaders, to stand for humanity, freedom, refugees, and other values, or not?
Well, we wouldn't be doing this job if we didn't think so. But I think what's really important is it's a long game. Now, we never thought we would get a special rapporteur in relation to Russia. So the Human Rights Council this year passed a resolution where we now have a special rapporteur in relation to Russia. We've had resolutions and movement in relation to Myanmar, Afghanistan, and many other countries. And obviously the international action that's happened in relation to Russia in terms of its invasion of Ukraine. So I think really what we're seeing is the fact is that whilst it's a long game, it is important that the international community is moving. And we have seen accountability. We only saw this year in Germany a case whereby an intelligence officer from Syria was brought to trial and found guilty of crimes against humanity in a German court this year. And so whilst the wheels of justice may be slow, whilst it seems like there may be impunity, in fact, it's not. And we will continue, as we have done day in, day out, to document violations and to call political leaders and others to account for the violations and abuses that they are carrying out.
Yeah, Yasmin Ahmed, Director of Human Rights Watch in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.